Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good to be here in beautiful, I would say sunny Alberta. Most of the time it's sunny Alberta, but I mean, there's got to be some rain. We know that, and there's a joyful celebration there of the anniversaries, and so great to, wow, to think of the height, 66 years married. Wow. And having to put up with kids, like next to you there. No, that's wonderful, and the fruits of a great life together, and and the Joes and Allens as well, of course. I mean, it's great to celebrate those things, very, very good things and beautiful things. That in a world that just seems to have trouble with relationships more and more, that people can learn to live together in peace and love and harmony through the ups and downs of life, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing and a wonderful example indeed. So. Great to celebrate that, that's for sure. We were in Saskatchewan last year in Manitou Springs. Actually, Jean and Christina are here, so you have to endure one sermon of the four that's a repeat. Otherwise, new material, okay? Manitou Lake, and I don't know if you've ever heard of this lake in Saskatchewan, but it's 4 times saltier than the Dead Sea. I mean, I'd never heard of it. And so the retreat, the church group was we were at up a hill at a community hall, but we stayed in this, it's an aging but very nice resort that draws water out of the lake into heated pools. About one pool, I think, is 38 Celsius, the other is 39 or 40, so they're plenty warm enough. But the most amazing thing is when you get in I got in the deep end first, and you just begin to lean back, and your whole body floats up, and your feet stick right up out of the water. I mean, the heels are in the water, but that's it. I've never seen such buoyancy. Because, the Dead Sea is several times saltier than the ocean, and Manitou Lake is 4 times saltier than the Dead Sea. So it's just amazing, and they claim it'll do all kinds of wonders, right? For arthritis and all. What ails you will be better by the end of your swim. So, but it was just the buoyancy of the water. I just found it, just kind of an amazing place. So Canada has these little wonders. I mean, I've talked to people from the prairies in our local church in Abbotsford at our study on Wednesday night who'd never heard of Lake Manitou. One of them had, Ray Anderson. Grew up in Saskatchewan, but no one else, and several grew up in Alberta, had even heard of it. So there's one of those little wonder gems, that exist in the country. Now, I'll tell you, the only downside is the mud. It really sticks to your shoes. Kylie went out to get some pics at the edge of the water and came back, kind of with 2 rubber boot kind of mud structures that we had to get her to scrape off. But that was minor. That was fun. And next weekend, we've got a retreat going in Penticton, Wendy, and we'll take Kylie and a friend of hers from school because they're doing a special youth-themed weekend. And I'll be in Moncton, New Brunswick. So I did spend 7 years pastoring there, and then 4.5 more in Nova Scotia. So it's always a wonderful opportunity to go and reconnect with brethren I've known and grown close to over the years. And so that'll be an enjoyable gathering as well. As far as news of the church in Canada, not a whole lot. I think you're aware that my plans are to retire in just under 2 years' time, and Bill Hall has been designated to replace me. The first phase of his job is to become office manager, and that's what he's doing now. Sorry, is my collar? That's the only thing of having a TV. You're looking at yourself, right? So there, is that better? I can see myself. There I am on television, how many of us get to be on TV, even if it's just to yourself? Oh, is that right? Okay, proof. Anyway, where was I anyway? Oh, Bill Hall, yeah. So his first step is to work with the office, and we have systems that we put in place, actually designing Bob Millman will know about the Insight system, but it was been about 18 or 20 years ago that it was completed. And so some of these things need to be redone. And so his first, phase of his job will be to think through all the office systems, the technology, simplify it. For example, we had a conference call Friday with our treasurer, Peter Crompton, who lives on the island, and our bookkeeper who comes in occasionally, James Buss, and Bill was in the office with me, and Barb, who works in the office, and me, of course. And about getting all of our paperwork stored on the cloud. And that would simplify the amount of space necessary. We could reduce, because half of our office is storage, 400 square feet, and documents you have to keep for 7 years. Some, like personnel records, you have to keep permanently. But there are most of your financial stuff, after 7 years, they can be, gotten rid of. But nevertheless, you've got 7 years of receipts, 7 years of, copies of bills, and so on and so forth. So a matter of kind of getting up with the times. This can be stored on wherever that is. It's good. There's time to retire, because to me this is just, as Wendy will explain, I'm very low tech. So I'm not the one to lead us to the cloud. Right? Someday I hope to ascend, and meet our Lord in the clouds. But I don't think that's the cloud they're talking about. But don't ask me to explain the difference. So So anyway, somewhere in this cloud you can put stuff, all your information, and it doesn't have to be in a box at the back. Hence, you can reduce the amount of physical office space you need to lease because you're not having so much storage. So that's the bottom line. So a number of these things that we're going to be working through over the next year and a half, so that when Bill takes the full responsibility as national director, he'll have hopefully worked through a lot of the maintenance issues, everything, brought it up to date, and we hope to get to the point where, I guess what they call it anymore is office in a box, in the sense that we could take the office, put it in a box as it were, and I guess you can connect with your cloud wherever you go. Isn't that amazing? Eh? So if you have high speed internet, you can be anywhere in the world, and we could move the office. Independently of the U.S. thinking, and you may have heard that Mr. Tkach and the team in Glendora have decided to begin the process of moving the office from the west coast of the United States to North Carolina, Charlotte, actually near Charlotte. So hopefully it'll settle down before the move. But anyway, normally it's been a peaceful, pleasant, community. As you know, there was the police shooting and all controversies, but they wouldn't be right in Charlotte anyway. They'd be outside of it. Is kind of the general area. But you may be aware, 2/3 of the population of the United States still lives east of the Mississippi River, even though it's probably only 1/3 or less of the geography, if you look at a map. And it's true that about 1/3 of our congregations and membership live where the population is, east of the Mississippi River. So we don't need to have the U.S. office on the West Coast, is what I'm saying. Internationally, we don't care where in the States it is, right? I mean, in one sense, it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. When Bill first came out and saw the price of housing in Vancouver area, we realized the challenge we'd have. And Barb will be retiring soon. Her husband's a teacher. She's getting closer to that point. Replace her, like as a nonprofit, we can't afford to pay the kind of salaries a family would need to live in the lower mainland, unless you hire someone who's already there and has their housing arranged. But if you're looking at the freedom of hiring people and so on, and we realized that with the beautiful airports across Canada now, including many of our mid-sized cities, flying into Saskatoon, I must say that airport is really lovely. When Wendy was there last, it was under construction, and she had a sense it's kind of an Abbott's Fordonian size. We have our nice little 4-gate airport, okay, so don't knock it. It's very few lineups, cheap parking, but it's like a big warehouse, kind of place. But Hamilton's the same thing. But Saskatoon, a lovely airport. In fact, on the seat back, come sit in a chair in the airport voted the most improved in North America last year. So I mean, so there are places, in other words, like that you've got good air service, both east and west, in Canada. You've got high-speed internet. You've got much more affordable housing situations where I think, so we're looking at options now in Canada. And when I found out from Dr. Tkach and Greg Williams when I was in at the last mission developer meeting, and they brought this up, I had to laugh. I said, boy, it's so funny. I said, we're thinking the same thoughts. And sometimes you find out independently, even though we're 1/6 the size as far as membership and number of churches in Canada compared to the States, of course it has a much larger population, that we end up driven by the same forces in terms of, things that are going on in management and finances and so on. And so we're considering that. So that's all part of the process. Appreciate your prayers for wisdom, on what we do over the next year and a half or so. And, almost 2 years, but, I will retire. Bill will have the responsibility, and Jerry and the board will be fully behind him, I'm sure, and, will be made aware of all this as we continue to, as they are already to a degree, as we work all these things through. So, anyway, that's where that stands. People ask, is the church growing in Canada? And I'd say typical of Christianity in Canada, it's kind of holding its own. It seems to be about where things are at. Although, I was pleasantly surprised when I chip count a month ago. I just wondered where we'd be relative to where we were a year ago. And actually, we're up about 25 or 30 members. Out of 2,500, we're about 25 or 30 more. And that's with a number of people dying, of course. So it means that we replaced the number that passed away in the last year and added some. So I think that was largely in certain centers such as Ottawa, where our church is now, probably 20-25% of the Ottawa church is now refugees from Africa, many of whom were members of GCI in Africa, who've emigrated to Canada, and the more that do, they become a community, right? And so now it's become a significant chunk of the church. It was lovely being there last fall in Ottawa. They had a youth choir, and 11 of the 12 teens in it, which is nice to have even that number, right, in a church of 50, 60, 70 people, but were African kids who now are Canadian and part of the congregation. So there's some really, really good things. And they're natural evangelists. They're willing to talk about the gospel. Because one of the families I met there, get this is really, you want to see a church grow fast, have a family of 12 show up. Okay. They're from the Congo, met one of our members in Ottawa, and they got talking about Christianity, which easily happens in those circles. And anyway, the couple said, well, we're fairly new to the country. We haven't really settled in a church, and it was actually our elder there, who's African, said, well, Musafari said, well, why don't you try ours? We've got a number of, we got traditional Canadians, French and English. We got, but we have a number of Africans too. It's a nice mix of people, and so they began coming about a year ago, and they haven't stopped. But there was, 13. Mom, Dad, and the kids, 10 kids, and one of them's married. That's it. That's how you get the 13th. So a baker's dozen of people. So that's, a whole row, kind of packed, suddenly shows up. But you talk to the stories. The lady had been shot in Africa and was on her 4th surgery. I guess the bullet went into her jaw and her cheek. Remember that, Wendy? And so they threw 3 or 4 surgeries, and there's another one coming to try to repair it, So, boy, some of them have been through a lot, and you're able to live in, they said the biggest thing of Canada is just said, yeah, it's cold in the winter, we're still getting used to it, but it's safety. So just walking down the street without fearing you're going to get shot, or run into someone with an AK-47 who decides to unload on you for who knows what reason. They said that is just such a blessing. So, anyway, those things are happening, and they're exciting. Okay. Otherwise, the rest of us are getting older year by year. But, though the outward man perishes, the inward man is constantly being renewed. So, isn't that beautiful? We can grow spiritually and closer to God and learn more to the very day we die, and then we transition to real life. So, how's that for an optimistic and true biblical view of where we're heading? So, looked at that way, it's all good, right? In the end. All right, so today I want to talk about, the sermon is drawn from John 6. And so other than one passage toward the end of it, that's where I'll stay, just to keep life simple. In John 6, we have, one of the most famous miracles recorded in the Bible, and that is where Christ fed the 5,000. The loaves and fishes. The crowd was out there. They began to be hungry late in the day. Jesus saw that and said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. In verse 7, Philip answered him, 8 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Well, you can imagine. Who's going to pick up the lunch bill for 5,000 people? And it might have been men. We don't know if that was a count of males or if it was generically men, men, women, and children, or if it was males, in which case there could have been 12, 15, 17,000 people. So, I mean, either way, even if you took it to McDonald's, admit it, that's going to be a lot of annual pay to cover lunch. So that's what Philip was saying. I can go to the market and buy food. It would take 8 months of a man's, of a workman's salary, and you still probably wouldn't get enough to feed this crowd. I know Joyce is feeding people. Hopefully not 5,000, but anyway. And so you know the story. A little boy. I like this little boy. You know why I like him? Because he had the brains to realize there might involve being there a long time, and he planned ahead. He brought lunch. Did nobody else of the 5,000 think to bring lunch? I pose that question. I can't answer it. It's one of those theological things. We'll have to wait for the resurrection, right? We'll find out, I guess. Either that or others had lunch, but they weren't about to share it. Now, that's quite possible, knowing human nature. Some kept it in the bag, and that's where it was going. I'm going to eat, but I'm not, But this little kid produced the loaves and fishes. He had thought ahead. He had planned. Wendy will tell you, when I get up in the morning, there's times I ask her, what's for dinner tonight? And she's saying, I haven't even begun to think about that. I'll decide that mid-afternoon should I thaw some chicken or beef, right? But that's me. It gets me through the day. You have to admit, if you think doesn't it help you get through, work? I pose that as another question. The little boy would understand my thinking if nobody else here does. Anyway, so they sat down. The miracle of the food was accomplished, and this set things up for probably the greatest degree of public popularity that Jesus ever had in his ministry. In verse 15, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew into a mountain by himself. So he knew the crowd was on the verge of just thrusting him into, we're going to crown you king. You will reign over us. And so it was probably the greatest level of public popularity Jesus ever experienced when they were make him king and follow him wherever, overthrow the Romans, whatever needed to be done. Tremendous apparent enthusiasm for him. And that led to him being more open than he ever had about who he really was and why he had come into the world, culminating, beginning in verse 41, in a passage that will tie into what we'll do at the end of service, taking the bread and the wine. And at this the Jews began to grumble about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. And they said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? And again, we have to put ourselves in this first century context. Jesus was of their generation. Some of them in that crowd probably had hired Joseph's son or Joseph and Sons, to fix the back porch on the house, or some first century equivalent, right? Like they were builders, it says carpenters, but generally a carpenter then was more of a bit of a general contractor, would look after solving a roof problem or, whatever. More than just woodwork. They weren't as specialized as today. I do wood, someone else does plumbing, someone else does steel. You tend to go in and you do what's required for construction. And so, I went to school with the brother and sister. We worshiped at the local synagogue together. Right? For us, we've kind of grown up with the idea that Christ is a special person of some sort. And, it's kind of not as big a stretch perhaps. But if it had been somebody of your generation that grew up in your town or village, right, gone to school with, that you had hired to maybe, when Christ's father apparently died when he was young. I know the movie, The Passion of the Christ, there is a very good scene where Christ is building a table, if you remember that scene, and it's fairly high. And his mom said, well, this is, kind of joking with him. He said, this is really ridiculously high. And he said, oh, it must be for a big man. He said, yeah, it's for a big man, right? But I mean, if you bought that table, let's say you paid him, he built a table, specially designed it because you're a big person, and delivered it to your house. A good guy, sure, yeah, I charged a fair price, didn't cheat me, that was all good. But the bread from heaven, the Son of God that came down from heaven, that's a big stretch over. I enjoy, he did a good job for me on the back, right? So they had a hard time with this, taking this, but it was true. It was true. Obviously, it was true. I'm just saying maybe we should put ourselves in the first century context of those people and realize that was a stretch. I mean, that was hard. That was something that was not easy to go there any more than it would be for any of us. So he goes on to say, it is written in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. And it's a reference in the prophets to the fact that God himself would teach, would open the minds of people. And what he's leading up to here is, you can't receive this without God drawing you. Right? It does take an involvement of God to make this leap, to really understand who Christ was, embrace it. And I think we understand that there is that calling. There's still the need for us to embrace the calling. So it doesn't do away with us having a choice, but it does take a calling from God, does it not, to respond to God? And so, and it goes on to say, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who listens to the Father and learns from him comes to me. So the only way to Christ is through the Father drawing you, opening your mind. No one has seen the Father except the one who is from God. Only he has seen the Father. I tell you the truth, he who believes has everlasting life. I am the bread of life. Your forefathers ate the manna in the desert, yet they died. Remember the miracle of the manna, how they were fed, but it was still just physical food. And it got them through that day, or the week portion on Friday, if you remember. So, get them through the weekly Sabbath. It was under the Old Covenant administration, obviously. But they died, right? It didn't give them eternal life. It just, it was physical food. But here is the bread that comes down from heaven, which a man may eat and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I give for the life of the world. So wow, this is powerful teaching. This goes from being the carpenter's son, the builder's son, Joseph's son, the oldest of the group, good guy, honest guy. Actually, I've got no negative memories of him. He was always a positive, friendly, generous, a kind person. I'm sure that, it says he grew in favor in stature with God and man. But this life has come down from heaven. If I eat his flesh, and obviously metaphorically, I'm going to live forever. But that's who he was. You read John 1, he was with God and was God. Like the Word was with God, the Word was God and became flesh. This is indeed who he was and why he came into the world. And so he's getting right to the core of it. His whole purpose, his whole reason for being born, who he was. Then the Jews in verse 52 began to argue sharply among themselves, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? And Jesus said to them, I tell you the truth, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. So it's the only way to life. Whoever eats this flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. Flesh is real food, and my blood is real drink. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I am in him. And that remains is an important word, remains in me and I in him. It's not just a matter of accepting Christ, kind of like getting a ticket to heaven, right? Where when you're 18 in a tent meeting, you accept Christ in some kind of an emotional meeting, and then you go live your life as if there's no God. But you got this thing in here now, see? This is it. I got it, right? I accepted Christ, and it's in the Bible. There. So now you go live any way you want, okay? And you die. And this is how the story goes, right? You go before St. Peter at the Golden Gates, who says, what's your name again? Oh, dear me. Man, your life was a complete mess. You're a wreck. You need to the basement, right? You're going the other direction. He says, Oh, sorry, I almost forgot. I've got here right in a ticket to heaven when I was 18. Oh, well, why didn't you say? Why didn't you say so? That first class car right there, you know. No, it's not about that, is it? It's about coming into relationship. Christ gave us what we rejected in Eden, our earliest parents. Remember, God walked with Adam in the cool of the evening. There was relationship. We chose to live apart from God. Human decision. God's purpose has been to restore us back to relationship with Him, and through Christ that is possible. So when we accept Christ, the idea is we are now enabled to come into relationship with God, to remain in Him. Right? It's not just a matter of touching Him one way, it's remaining in Him. We can now live in that relationship. That's the way we're meant to live life, in relationship to Father, Son, and Spirit. That's what Christ came to make possible, to remain in Him. Although, I don't know, Gary Detto had a good analogy to this. He said it would be, to think otherwise would be to think, if a man said to a woman, I want to marry you, now I don't want to live with you. Okay, but I do want to marry you. I will live in Newfoundland, and you can live here in Alberta, and we'll be married. You can rest assured. It'll be a legal marriage. We'll have a great ceremony and everything. But I really don't want to live with you. Well, you'd say, well, then, what is this? Like, what is marriage? Well, it's a relationship, isn't it? It's a covenant two people make, a man and a woman make, in order together to share life, to live in relationship with each other. Not to know that is not to understand what marriage is. Those couples who have lived so long together have formed a powerful bond between them, living in relationship together, sharing life. In many cases, raising kids together. They've done these things, and there's this unity then that is intended to be created over time through this tremendous sharing. It's remaining together. That's the analogy that we should think of when we think of coming to Christ. The idea is that we are intended to remain in Him in us. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so the one who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread of life that came down from heaven. Your forefathers ate manna and died, but he who feeds on this bread forever. In this chapter, Christ, and in this book of John, this gospel, Christ gives the 8 great I am statements of the gospels. Beginning right here, I am the bread of life which came down from heaven. Later in the book, next chapter, it says, he said, I am the light of the world. Chapter 10, he says, I am the door of the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I am the Son of God. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. Those are the 8. And they're all found in the Gospel of John, and the first one begins here in chapter 6 of that Gospel. And each one of these statements represents a particular relationship of Jesus to the needs of men and women. Jesus is our light in the darkness. He is the gate to security, the shepherd that guides us. He is the way, the truth, and the life. In every one of these, we see that Jesus wants us to receive Him, not for the gifts He can give us, but for what He can be to us. Now, and this will constitute the rest of the message, there are 3 areas of concern that were expressed that seem to be the issues that blocked people. So many in this large crowd. So that by the end of this chapter, you're down to Jesus saying to the immediate circle, the 12, are you too also going to go away? Remember Peter's response, where would we go? You have the words of eternal life. But it came to that point. So you go from multiple, who knows how many thousands, down to your core group. And even then you're asking, are you leaving as well? Like, am I going to be down to myself? So what were these blockages? Well, the first we could call the materialist. Many people who followed Jesus at this point were hoping for more of a political savior, giving political solutions, free handouts, material goodies. In fact, Jesus in verse 26, Jesus answered, I tell you the truth, you're looking for me. This is when they came and they, again, were kind of chasing him around. They wanted to forcibly make him king. I tell you the truth, you're looking for me, not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. Do not work for food that spoils, but for first to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. On him the Father has placed the seal of approval. So he realized they were very much into this world still. And because of this free food, there's this ability to create bread and salted barley loaves and salted fish out of virtually nothing. Well, it's obviously he could do this. Now, again, a little bit of the political background at the time can be helpful. There was a program in Rome at this time called Bread for Peace. And Rome became the way to control Rome for the Caesars. Eventually devolved into what's known in history books as bread and circuses. Right? Give them free food, the masses, the unemployed masses especially, and entertain them. Okay. I remember seeing pictures of the Colosseum in Rome, which seated 50,000 people. And this is where they had gladiatorial fights and entertainments. Some of them pretty bloody. Beyond WWF, they really did die there, right? But nevertheless, lions, they had all of this stuff going on. 50,000 could attend. They had an even larger one for chariot races and bigger scale events called the Circus Maximus, which some say could seat up to 300,000 people. Now you think of one of the biggest stadiums in the United States is the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, which I believe seats about 101 or 103,000 max. This could handle up to 300,000. So the Roman Empire at the time, they estimated 1 million people, which at the time, some say, was about half the population of the earth. There's about 200 million people alive, half of whom lived in the bounds of the Roman Empire. 2 million of the 100 million in the Roman Empire lived in the city of Rome. So if you could control the Roman masses, right, and make sure that by taxing the rest of the empire and so on, that you could make sure that they always have bread and you kept them entertained and pacified, then you could rule Rome. So the idea of food ruler. Ruler can provide food, bread, salted, incredible amounts, impossible. That was very much part of the attraction. So Jesus said, you've come after me because I fed you. That's what you're after. And what I'm about is so much bigger than that. So that's the first text. Now, can we apply it to our modern age? And I suppose, when you think of the health wealth gospel, that's often used to attract people. I know it's used in Africa. I know members down in Johannesburg were telling me a few years ago of a person who flew in and made promises to them. He said, I've been given a vision by God. Okay. And so how do you disprove or prove that? Anyway, he makes this statement that the first 2,000 of you first 1,000 of you that send me 2,000 rand, which would be about 200 Canadian dollars, today's exchange rate approximately, are going to be made millionaires. So you take, a lot of these are unemployed or low-paid people. So they go home and they desperately try to borrow, whatever they got to do to get 2,000 rand and mail it in. Right, because let's face it, you wouldn't want to be the 1,001st, right? Because you don't get to become a millionaire. You got to be in that first 1,000. That's about manipulation. He gets on his private jet and flies back to Europe or America, and manipulation of the poor, of a place, Elaine's been there, where they need help. You don't go down there sucking money out of people. I mean, how obscene can that be, right? But this stuff does go on. In fact, many of the groups that want to affiliate with us have been through this to a degree and see a purity of the gospel on the website, believe it or not. And that's partly what's moving them, because they've been taken advantage by this materialistic gospel. Now, how do we balance all this? Because is God not concerned about our physical state? Well, I believe he is. I mean, take Proverbs. An entire book that has an awful lot to do with wisdom and how to, prosper, how to have a decent life today, right? And you can think where the promises in the New Testament that God knows your needs and will help provide them. But certainly you can't read the New Testament and get any sense that the primary goal of life is to get more stuff. Right, like the bumper sticker, the years I lived here, I do remember one of the first YOU events I went to in Calgary, and I ended up in heavy traffic behind a guy with a bumper sticker that said, "He who dies with the biggest pile of toys wins, ... It didn't tell you what you won, right? What do you can't take any of it with you that I've ever been able to perceive. The pharaohs did, right? Bury me with all my stuff and kill slaves and throw them in there, and because I'm going to take it with me. They believed, they hoped. But we know the truth is you don't. As Job so wisely said, naked came I into this world and naked go I out, right? In other words, they may put you in a suit or a dress, but, that's the undertaker being kind and all that. So that's the truth of the matter. And so Jesus said you can gain the whole world and lose your soul. And what's the point of that? So very clearly, the emphasis of the New Testament is on the great spiritual truths, the eternal life, which is what Christ is talking about. This is the bread that gives you eternal life. You're so worried about eating today, so you get more free food tomorrow, right? And really, you're missing the whole point. And so that was a factor. Second group, in verse 28, they asked him, what must we do to do the work God requires? Now, throughout Christian history, the church has often fallen into the sin of legalism. The problem is, it's easier to make rules than to build relationships. Jesus wants to live in the heart of every individual believer. He sent his Son, or his Spirit, I should say, to write his law in our hearts. In other words, to change us from the inside. If the love of God is in us, then we will keep all the biblical principles of morality, not hurting people, not stealing from them, not killing them, right, and so on, not lying about them. That's how God accomplishes that. He calls every one of us to study his word for ourselves, to learn from him, and so on. But some people simply don't want a relationship with God. They'd rather find a strong leader and memorize a set of rules. And when the crowd demanded a list of works, Jesus gave them this surprising answer. Notice verse 29, John 6. The work of God is this. He said, okay, you want to work? You want to know what's required, what work you need to do? Here's his answer. The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent. You want to work? Here's the work. Trust me. Believe what I say. And you can think that's so simple, and yet it is not as much as you think. We were in... They had the mission developer meetings in Bogota, Colombia, which is, by the way, 8,200 feet above sea level. And, so I'm not saying, if you go there, be prepared to be at extremely high altitude. At times at night, I'd wake up just breathing heavy. And when I talk to others, same thing. So don't go there and take off jogging. You may wake up, flat in your face somewhere because the air is really much thinner. Now, it's a lovely, interesting place. Oh, dear me, a city of 8 million people and culture, the churches, tremendous Christian heritage. Although I was actually robbed. Touring a church, I lost my new BlackBerry. I'm still grieving it. So I thankfully had not thrown out my old one. So I've gone back to my little Z10. But anyway, thankfully it still works. So there you go, touring a church. Oh, dear me. Oh, we're an ironic world, aren't we? I was robbed at a church, but anyway. I mean, he didn't hurt me. In fact, he was very good. Whoever did it, man, or maybe it was a woman, I don't know. But they were good because I felt nothing, and we were all warned, watch your stuff. So I took emergency calls, and I had it in a pocket with Velcro and touched it every couple minutes. You just make sure it's still there. I was paranoid. Wendy, Kylie would tell you, I'm a moderately paranoid person about a number of things like this. And I was still robbed. So I had to think, they were so good. They came, they opened the flap, they took that thing, and with people around me, Jack Koss' daughter Melissa and her husband worked for the U.S. State Department. They were touring us and spending some time. It was the day after the conference. And they were watching us, like we were all together, and they did it. So, it's nice to see somebody good at his work. But... it's one of these things you think, if you're this good at something, you could get a real job, and prosper legitimately, right? Robbing people, touring a church. I mean, let me not get off on that. But what was interesting, one of the days, they wanted us to have a chance to see the area, so we had a couple days of meetings, a day off, and a couple more days of meetings. A member had a couple tour buses of the congregation, and we have a good-sized church, actually, in Bogota. And took us around, and we ended up going up a cable car to a church called Montserrat, which is, again, the city's about 8,200 feet. This is up around 10,000. And a beautiful architecture. I mean, it's lovely. The view was fabulous. But what was interesting, the tour guide said, on every Friday, And big time on the Friday before Easter, thousands of people come up the hundreds of steps, okay, on their hands and knees, and are cut and bleeding, and then come around to the couple meters to the church building, and there's a statue of Peter where they kind of go down and hold it, and it's covered in blood by the end of the day. I don't know how sanitary it is, but anyway, it is what it, but, and look, very sincere, obviously, and you're in a very Christian culture. So, and I'm not throwing, we've made mistakes, okay, so don't take this as a stone-throwing thing. But it just shows the human propensity. I mean, we sure had a background in being legalistic, right, in many ways. We focused so much on the law that we missed, in many cases, the fullness of the relationship with Christ, which is one of the most wonderful things in my life of the last years, including beginning when I was your pastor, as we worked through it together. So I'd never go back. I had no interest in it whatsoever. But to obtain think about this, forgiveness of Christ, you would need to cut and bleed yourself. Why couldn't we just believe that Jesus, who was cut and bled and died for us, that's sufficient? But you know what I'm saying? You get into this where, yeah, but that's too simple. Like, just accept it. Doesn't that let them off too easy? Or let you and me off too? Wouldn't it be better if we did have to crawl up a mountainside, and get, cut and bloodied a couple times a year, just to really, but it's in the human heart, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Even in a Christ-centered culture in many ways, and some of their greatest art was beautiful. It was beautifully Christian. The Salt Cathedral, where the salt mine workers worked, carved these, the different stations of the cross and the story of Christ out of the salt rock. I mean, amazing stuff and moving for a Christian. So, well worth saying, okay? So I hope I'm putting this in a balanced way, but I'm just saying there's this propensity, even believers have, to move to legalism. It's so hard to simply believe what Jesus said, and that's it. Yeah, just accept it. That's all. The work of God for you? Believe what I say. Yeah, but too easy. I mean, okay, yeah, I'll believe, but let me add something, let me do my part, or let me, earn half of it or something. Anyway, so we can see it then, the question that was asked, but we can see to this day as human beings, we struggle with the grace of God. If I were God, and which is a very good thing I'm not, which I agree with you, and the more you know me, the better, the more you'd agree with this. But if I were going to save people, I would construct a series of hoops you'd have to jump through, right, to earn it, or to, prove that you're real or something. It's to simply do it, go and die for you, and then offer it by grace, this relationship, right? In one sense, it's I guess, the offense of the cross. It just seems to be, no, it can't be that way. It's too easy. You got to suffer a bit, right? You got to earn it. Then you'll appreciate. I could give you a whole line of reasoning as to why, and that's what it's called, religion. This is why we humans, we design it this way, where it's based on, there's a God, and you got a set of rules, and you learn to live by them. You're in the gratefulness of the God, and maybe He'll love you and do it better. He'll love you more, and and that's how it goes. But identity, it's based upon trust, in belief, in confidence in what He has done. Oh, it does afflict human beings. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Les Miserables, or the stage play perhaps years ago. But, Victor Hugo, the author, obviously had a tremendous grasp of the core of Christianity. Remember when the priest, gave, when Jean Valjean was accused, which he had done, of stealing the silver from the church. And the police apprehended him and brought him in, the gendarme, the police. And the Monsignor said, oh, no. He said, this man didn't steal it. I gave it to him. In fact, he said, I'm surprised, Jean Valjean, you forgot two of the more expensive pieces, right? And this priest gave him, set him up. He became a businessman, the mayor of a part of Paris, I gather. And the powerful effect of unmerited pardon. That's really what Victor... But then the policeman who for his lifetime went after him. And when Jean Valjean, what's the policeman's name? It's Janvier, yeah. Janvier. Okay. What Wendy said. Russell Crowe. That I can say. Anyway, who chased him all his life to make him pay. Remember, he'd stolen bread to feed a hungry niece or nephew, for which he got 5 years in prison. The fourth year, apparently, he tried to escape with that. Then he was in prison so he ended up doing 19 or 20 years for stealing bread for a hungry, seemingly miserable legal system, merciless, right? But anyway, he did that, but this guy couldn't let it go because he broke parole. So it's kind of a lifetime goal. I'm going to make you pay. You are going to... The full force of the law, I could only see it in legalistic terms. And then his life was spared, right, by Jean Valjean. And the policeman, he killed himself. He jumped off a building. And you realize, that's sometimes it's that way. Just to accept grace, to receive it and give it, he just could not do it. The man could not do it. He could only think black, white, right, wrong, law, legal terms, right? You're this or you're that. And if you're that, there's no... the idea of mercy, the idea of change, the idea of redemption, he could not embrace it, not do it. Judgment, punishment, those things he understood. And so when he received grace from this guy that he spent his lifetime trying to get, he couldn't live with it. He could not only could he receive it, he couldn't even go on living with the tension of it. So it's a struggle of humanity. And part of the crowd, this is where they were at. They just could not accept what Jesus was offering. The third and final category were the sensationalists. In verse 30, these people asked Jesus this absurd question: what miraculous sign will you give that we may see it and believe you? What will you do? Now think about it. Jesus had just fed over 5,000 people with 2 fish and 5 barley loaves. The very next day, having gained the motivation from that to get across the lake and go after him and kind of hunt down where he was, the very next day they're asking for a sign. Now, obviously, the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 gave them enough faith to climb into boats and row all the way across the lake to find Jesus, but yesterday's miracle was not enough to last, apparently, till the morning. So what's the next trick? What are you going to do? That's what are you going to do next? Looking for a sign, looking for the big miracle, the wow. Now, can that happen today? Can we end up, seeking, wanting, going after the wow effect, craving spiritual excitement, the latest, greatest, newest thing? I remember a gentleman, I pastored for a while in New Brunswick. He was a welder at the St. John Dry Dock. But I remember talking to me, and he'd come from a very emotional background in terms of religion. And he said, it got to where I needed kind of a very emotional sort of pump-me-up service on Sunday. But then I needed it more than that. So I started getting it Tuesday night. I found another place where that is. And then I needed it Thursday. I began to get to where I needed it every other day. And I realized I was kind of just going from spiritual high to spiritual high, or seeking anyway a spiritual high. Now, Jesus did not design the Christian life that it would be just mountaintop to mountaintop all the time. Right? Sometimes there's valleys, and he'll walk you through the valley of the shadow of death, but there are valleys and there are peaks. And I know, looking back over my Christian life, there's times when I felt very close to answers to prayer that I know were from him. Like the telephone commercial, reach out and I feel like I could reach out and touch God. He's that close, he's that real. But that's not every day. It's not, he's not designed that to happen all the time. On occasion, we have those kind of mountaintop experiences. So I'm not putting that down or knocking that. Maybe you've had some of them, and I hope you do, because they can be very validating to faith and very encouraging. But it's not all the time. And to seek that as your main relationship with God is a constant diet. God just doesn't provide it. And maybe I won't turn there. I'll just refer to a passage I think most of you know well in 1 Kings 19, 11 through 13. If you remember the story, Elijah had confronted the prophets of Baal. And a tremendous miracle. Fire that came down, destroyed the altar. 400 prophets of Baal, I think it was, were killed. And word got back to Jezebel, Ahab's queen, wife, who was, Jezebel is like, I don't know, like, but my favorite, most frightening movie, but my favorite movie that I watched every year, growing up was The Wizard of Oz. And so when you're 4 and 5, though, The Wicked Witch of the East was a seriously bad person to me, right? I still remember being like 5 years old, and when she was on, I would go back to the doorway and just kind of look around. Like I wanted to see it, but I wanted a wall between us, right? I couldn't handle full, frontal thing to the screen with The Wicked Witch of the East. And Jezebel is a classic, right, of that. So she said, you tell Elijah, this time tomorrow he's a dead man. That's what she said. I'll get him. He will die for what he did. And you know what, it's funny, having been used by God in such a powerful way, what's his reaction? Well, he takes off running. He goes deep into the wilderness, and he sits under a tree, a gourd, or some kind of a tree. A gourd is the Jonah story. But anyway, some kind of a bush, shade, and wishes he could die. Right? He's deeply depressed, just drained by the whole experience, and apparently in a depression. Anyway, so God, make a long story short, begins to reveal himself to him. But what's interesting is the first thing is that God creates an earthquake. Now, if you've ever been there, frightening things. There's a relationship most of us have with the ground. It's very trusting. When things like getting my feet on solid ground, right? I mean, on Christ, the solid rock, right? You trust me. You've been through an earthquake, and that relationship is fractured temporarily. It is frightening. I don't know if Bob was in California, the Silmar earthquake, but I remember the day after, any aftershock, and we were jumping out of the classroom. I mean, just ready to fly into the. It is something. Wendy's been through, maybe a number of you have been through, you get up into a 6.1 or 3, whatever it was, it's big enough to really rock your world. And I remember one guy driving to work, thankfully it happened at 6:01 or 2 in the morning, but had drove an old Cadillac, and he was going down the freeway, and he said it's like a wave on the ocean came through cement, like rolled up the highway. He popped up in the air as he went over it and flat down, and it blew all 4 tires. It ripped them right off the car. He slid to a stop on the belly in this old 58 Cadillac, whatever he was driving. But, I mean, it's just wild. 62 people died. 20 years later, there were people sleeping fully clothed in L.A. because psychologically they could not take off their clothing, get into underclothing or bed clothing for fear of an earthquake, and they'd have to run out in the street. So, but it says that he wasn't in the earthquake. And then there was a wind, powerful wind, and again, damage. You think poor Jamaica may be hit in the next day or two. St. Lucia was last night it was temporarily a Category 5 hurricane before, but that's still 250 kilometer an hour winds sustained. That is, brutal. Philippines has been through a major one a few years ago. Just absolutely. Some of them are so bad they can virtually pull. I think one that hit Guatemala many years ago actually pulled the asphalt out of the road. Just sucked the very pavement up into the sky and left a hole. So this can be very intense. But God wasn't in that. And then there was a fire. You think of Fort McMurray. Right? That was fearful watching that on TV for all of us across Canada, I guess around the world. But the power of fire, you think, fire, I heard at first there's a fire up near Fort Mac, and we're from Canada, and there's woods and there's fires, and surely, we'll get control of it. But then you realize this thing was growing so fast, control, and began to eat into the community. 24 or 500 homes were eventually completely destroyed, and it may be several years before the city can rebuild itself. And so, these are frightful things. Fires, forest fires, getting caught in them. You can't outrun them, right? In some cases, people have been trapped, and there is no way out. It will jump you and surround you. It's vicious. Talk to people who've lived through that. Just absolutely awful. But he wasn't in the fire. But you know what followed? A still, small voice. And that's how God spoke to him. And it illustrates something. Here this man had been used to do dramatic miracles and all the rest of it, but in the end, what he needed was that steady, quiet, inner relationship with God. That's all of us, every day. Occasional peaks, but for most of us, most of the time, it's that still, small voice, isn't it? It's God through His Spirit convicting us, working with us, speaking to us, That's how he deals with us. He doesn't scream and yell at us. It's a still, small voice. He doesn't force us. Right? He wants a son or daughter who is willingly in this relationship with him. That still small voice. That's when God came to him and spoke to him and began to rebuild him. Right? All right, we're going to feed you. We're going to let you rest, and began to give you an assistant, Elisha, and so on and so forth, and began to deal with you build a whole sermon on how God dealt with him as a depressed person, discouraged person, broken person. But it was the still small voice. That's what I want to emphasize. And so wants to do is put us in relationship with him every day of the year so that we are instant in prayer, meaning there's always that line open. Doesn't mean you're kneeling and praying all day long, but there's that openness with God. He's always there, and of course the more we're aware of him, we can live in that relationship. That's what it's all about. The occasional peak thing is God will give it to you perhaps from time to time in your life. Where you'll feel really close to him or see just a miraculous answer to prayer so quickly. We had one girl in our church, in our group on Wednesday night, our Pocket Bible Study group, who asked to be anointed by our pastor, Jim Miller, the Sunday before, and for her ear. And, she was saying, why don't we pray about it? She was going to try to get it. This was going to be a long wait. And then he said, well, did you want me to anoint you? Or he was, and she said, yeah, okay. She had never actually heard of it. She's a fairly new member. So he said, well, it's where we pray, and, just based on James. And so he did. And again, we anoint and pray for people, and sometimes it takes a long time. A few of them have died. So I'm not saying, we have to live with God's answer, right? But in this case, he prayed that she would wake up the next morning and have no pain in her ear. And she went home that night and, went to bed and kept thinking, when's it going to stop? And it didn't. And she said, oh, well. Wakes up the next morning, said it was noon. She was at work. And it dawned on her, my ear doesn't hurt at all. That rushing sound is gone. And so, there are, for her, that was, the touch of God. And, and there's other times where, God just wants us to learn patience and may let us live with something. Like Paul, right? My grace is sufficient for you. I'm not going to relieve you. So, we have to live with God's answers. I understand that. I've lived with that. We all do. But sometimes there are these things, which are just so intense, right, for the person. Such an encouragement for a young lady just, baptized not that long ago and just learning about God and the faith, isn't it? And so you see those things. You say, thank God, what a blessing, But that's the Christian life. But Jesus, the wine and the bread are all about us being able to come in relationship with him. We and him, but him and us. Think of even when we take the bread and wine. I've thought of that, how Christ is. It's a powerful image, isn't it? That's described. And Mr. Millman, Pastor Bob will, leave that now. But I hope some of these thoughts will help frame us in understanding it and more deeply appreciate that Jesus is indeed the bread of life. And how blessed we are in every way because of what he did.